يا أيها الناس قد جاءكم برهان من ربكم وأنزلنا إليكم نورا مبينا.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. O Allah, open my heart, make my task easy for me, and remove the knots from my tongue, so they may understand my speech. So to recap the aims of each of the lessons that we're going to cover, we will look at the letter names and the phonetic sound of each letter and the articulation point of each letter, which in Arabic we call the Makhraj. For each letter, we will pronounce it with one of the three short vowels on, Fatha, Kasra, Dhamma, and we will also pronounce the letter with Sukoon, which means free from one of these short vowels. So every letter in the Arabic alphabet will either have one of the short vowels on them or a sukoon on them. And a letter which is empty in the Quran is also in the state of sukoon. So the sukoon can be visible or it can be completely empty, i.e. it can be invisible, so it's still in the state of sukoon. So the letter name is Dal, and the phonetic sound is Da, and it's pronounced in the same way as the English D is pronounced. The articulation point is the tip of the tongue with the roots of the upper incisors, and it shares its articulation points with the letter Ta, which we've covered previously. So as we mentioned earlier, if a letter shares its articulation point with another letter, then we have to differentiate them with their characteristics, with their sifat. So the Dal is a thin letter, so you can see there's no concaving in the tongue, there's no echo in the mouth, and there's no narrowing in the throat, so it shouldn't be pronounced as Da. So it's a thin letter, so the tongue needs to be relaxed. Even though the tip of the tongue is raised up to touch the roots of the upper incisors, there should be no concaving and there should be no thickness sound in the mouth. So when it's pronounced with Fatha, Dhamma, Kasra, Da, Du, Di. And when it's pronounced with a sukoon on, then the characteristics of that letter are more clear and audible. So when I say Ada, then you can hear that I'm doing the bouncing sound which we previously had on Jeeb and Ba, which in Arabic we call Qalqala. So the Dal is the third letter of Qalqala that we have. So we've had Ba, Jim and Dal, which all have Qalqala. Aba, Aja, Ada. So as soon as you jump onto the articulation point, which is the tip of the tongue with the roots of the upper incisors, we have to come off the articulation point immediately. Ada, Ada. And this is how the Dal is pronounced with a sukoon. This letter name is Dhal, and the phonetic sound is The. So it has the same shape as Dal, but with the dots. So Dal is without the dots and Dhal is with the dots. And also the Dhal shares the articulation point, its articulation point with the letter Tha, which we covered in lesson 1. So therefore it's important that we distinguish the two letters through their characteristics. So they both have the same makhraj, the same articulation point, which is the tip of the tongue touching the lower edge of the upper incisors. So you're holding the tip of your tongue between your teeth. So when we pronounce the Dhal with one of the three vowels, Fatha, Dhamma, Kasra, The, Dhu, Thi. And when we pronounce it with the sukoon, you can hear the characteristics clearly, more clear when it's pronounced with a sukoon. So So in the Dhal, we have a restriction of the breath. So the breath is restricted from running, and the sound is allowed to run freely. Whereas for the Tha, both the sound and the breath were running. And the Dhal, So you're allowing the sound to run, but you're restricting the breath to run. So this is how you distinguish the two letters. And Al. So the next letter is Ra. The letter name is Ra, and the phonetic sound is also Ra. So here we can see that the Ra is a letter which is green, which means that it can be pronounced thickly. But this is one of the letters which can be pronounced thick or thin, depending on which vowel is on the letter itself. So let's look at the articulation point first of the letter. So the articulation point, or the makhraj of Ra, is the tip of the tongue with the upper surface, part of the upper surface of the tongue touching the upper gum. So the upper gum is the area just behind the central incisors on the hard palate. So here, just the area behind the central incisors. So this is where you should be touching for the letter Ra. Be careful it's not pronounced like the letter R in English, which in English is the letter R is also a tip letter, but it's pronounced by rolling the tongue back onto the hard palate. So make sure it's not pronounced like the English R, which is like a rabbit or roll, where you're curling the tongue back onto the palate. There should be no curling of the tip of the tongue back onto the hard palate. So make sure that the makhraj is the tip of the tongue and the part of the upper surface with the upper gum area, which is just behind the central incisors. So you can see when it's with a fatha or a dhamma, it's pronounced thickly. So remember how we make a letter into a thick letter. So here you can see there's a concaving in the tongue, and you can also see that because of the concaving we have an echo in the mouth and we have a narrowness in the throat. So you can see that this ligament here, which is between the epiglottis and the hyoid bone, has opened up to push back the epiglottis, causing a narrowing in the throat, which causes the echo sound, Ra, Ru. And when it's pronounced with a sukoon, and if it has a fatha or a dhamma before it, then it will be pronounced again with thickness, Ar, Ur. So it has to be pronounced with thickness when it's with a fatha or a dhamma, or when it's sakina with a fatha before it. So in this slide you can see that here the Ra is pronounced thinly, so the makhraj is still the same, so it's still the tip and the upper surface touching the upper gum, but when it carries a kasra, then you can see that there's no longer a concaving in the tongue, and there's no longer a echo in the mouth, and there's no narrowing in the throat. So it's pronounced thinly, and the tongue should not be thickened. So with a kasra it'd be ri, and if it was with a sukoon and a kasra before it, ir. So with a ri it will be thin, and with a sukoon and kasra before it, ir. So we can see a comparison of when Ra is made thick and when Ra is made thin. So when it carries a fatha or a dhamma, Ra, Ru, then there's a concaving here in the middle of the tongue, there's echo in the mouth, and there's narrowing in the throat. And when it carries a kasra, or it has a sukoon and kasra before it, then it will be pronounced thinly. There will be no concaving in the middle of the tongue, no echo in the mouth, and no narrowing in the throat. Ri. So Ra, Ru, Ar. Ri, Ir. So the Ra will be thin. So you can see how the Ra and the Ra with thickness is differentiated to the Ra with thinness. An important factor of pronouncing the Arabic Ra is to leave a small gap in the tip to pronounce it correctly. So how do we know that we're pronouncing it correctly? If you can trill your tongue, then you're at the makhraj of the Arabic Ra. So for example, if I say ar, then you're at the right makhraj. But for the English R, if I'm rolling or curling my tongue back onto the hard palate, then it's difficult to trill your tongue for the English R. So So if you put the tip of the tongue on the upper gum area behind the roots of the upper incisors, then you should be able to trill your tongue. Arr, arr, arr. So if you trill your tongue, this is one of the characteristics, trilling of the tongue in the letter Ra, which is a characteristic which is to be avoided. So in order to avoid this characteristic, or to minimize this characteristic that the Arabic Ra has, is by leaving a small gap in the tip of the tongue for the sound to escape through, and by pushing the tongue up and keeping the tip of the tongue up onto the gum area, not allowing it to move away, not allowing it to trill away. So pushing the tongue up with a strong adherence. So this is very important when pronouncing the Ra, especially when the Ra is with a sukoon. Because remember, as we said before, when any letter is with a sukoon, then the characteristics of that letter become more audible and more clear compared to when a letter is with a vowel, such as fatha, dhamma, kasra. So when I say ar, 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 then I'm sticking the tip of my tongue up on the gum and leaving a small gap to avoid the trilling. Ar. And when I say ur, ur, again I'm doing the same thing. I have to make sure that there's a small gap left in the tongue. And with the kasra, ir, ir, I have to make sure there's a small gap left in the tip of the tongue to control the trilling. So ar, ur, ir. So we have two letters here which share an articulation point. We have the letter name za or zai. So it has two names, za or zai. And we have the letter name Sheen, and the phonetic is sa. So za, zai, za as the phonetic sound, and Sheen is the letter name, and the phonetic sound is sa. So zai and Sheen share an articulation point. The articulation point of these two letters are the tip of the tongue touching behind the lower incisors. So here the tip is behind the lower incisors with a gap. So there should be a gap, a small paper thin gap between the tip of the tongue and the incisors. Otherwise, it would sound as if you're creating a lisp sound. So you have to make sure there's a small, tiny gap between the tongue and the back of the lower incisors. So when we pronounce the zai with the fatha, dhamma, kasra, za, zu, zi, and with the sukoon, az. And when we pronounce the Sheen with fatha, dhamma, kasra, sa, su, si, and with the sukoon, as. So if both letters are sharing an articulation point, we have to differentiate them by their characteristics. So the Sheen has the sound and the breath running, s, whereas the zai has the breath restricted and the sound running, as. So it's similar to the English z sound, as. So as and s, and both these letters are thin letters. So the letter name is Sheen, and the phonetic sound is sha. So Makhraj of Sheen, the articulation point of the Sheen, is the middle of the tongue touching the opposite upper palate. And Sheen shares the Makhraj with the letter Jim, which we had on lesson 1, which also is the middle of the tongue touching the upper palate. But if you remember with Jim, the tongue and the palate were flush, there was no gap. So the difference between the Jim and the Sheen, as they share an articulation point, is that with the Sheen you have a gap throughout the Makhraj where the sound can run through. So there's no restriction of sound. So ash. So when we pronounce the Sheen with the fatha, dhamma, kasra, sha, shu, shi, and when we pronounce it with a sukoon, you can hear the characteristics of the Sheen. Ash, ash. So you can hear that the sound is running and the breath is also running. And in lesson 1, we mentioned that the letter tha which is written, which is the same shape as ba, da, and letter tha, has 3 dots above. So when the tha is written at the beginning or in the middle, then it's written on one stalk. Whereas the sheen here, you can see it's written like a W underneath. So there's 1, 2, there's like a W underneath. So when you have a W underneath the 3 dots, then it's a sheen if it's written at the beginning or in the middle. And when it's written at the end of the word, then it's written in its full form, as it can be seen here. So let's summarize. Seen and sheen have the same shape. The difference is in the dots. The three dots above the sheen and no dots on the seen. So sha, shu, she. Sa, su, si. Za, zu, zi. Ra, ru, ri. So the ra and the zai have the same shape. The difference is in the dots above the zai. And remember, the ra with a fatha and the ra with a dhamma is thick, and the ra with the kasra is thin. Ra, ru, ri. The, du, the, da, du, di. So the dal and the zal have the same letter shape. The difference is in the dots above the zal. Students often get confused between the dal and the ra and the dal and the zai because they look similar. So if you see the difference in the shape of the dal, it's the bottom of the shape is more flattened as if it's sitting on the line, whereas the ra is more curved, as if it's standing up, and the dal is as if it's sitting down on the line. So just remember the shape here of the dal and the zal, and the ra as if it's standing up. So try to differentiate how it's written. And you can see the sheen and how the sheen is written at the beginning and the middle. So you won't see the end part of the letters, and the ra will look the same when it's written in the middle, beginning, or at the end. The same with the zai, and the same with the dal and the zal. So when the letters are read with sukoon, then be careful that you give them the right characteristics. So if you listen out, ash, as, az, ar, ir, ad, ad. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. O Allah, glory be to you, and all praise is due to you. I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship besides you, and I seek forgiveness from you, and I return to you in obedience.
وأن أتلو القرآن فمن اهتدى فإنما يهتدي لنفسه ومن ضل فقل إنما أنا من المنذرين.